So our goal is to have a little bit better understanding of some of the arguments that you might run into when you're talking to somebody who is not convinced that there is a God or that the Scripture is His Word. These are kind of foundational things before we can get to the text, and part of that reasoning and defending the hope that is within us. Tonight, as we move into more of dealing with biology, we leave the cosmos and these kind of larger scale ideas of where did the universe come from, and now we begin to look at the question of where does life come from. And before we get into that too much, I just want to give you an idea of some of the things that are out there that these guys like Bill Nye, I've got a quote here from Bill Nye, and then after that Neil deGrasse Tyson. These are mainstream science personalities, would be the way I would put it. These are guys that are influential, not just in the realm of dealing with the other guys with the PhDs, but these are the guys who are influential, that's a word if I say it properly, influential with young people. They are the experts that the pundits have on their TV shows. So they have a lot of influence. And here's a quote from Bill Nye, and I'll tell you, I'm one of those guys with quotes, I try really hard to make sure I'm not just grabbing it out of context. Right? If you have something totally out of context, you could make anybody say just about anything. But this came up in a discussion between Bill Nye and students, and it came up multiple times. So this is a specific quote, but it came up multiple times from him. And so the question is asked, how can you prove life arose by natural processes? And Bill Nye says, we haven't proven it. Now that is true, and I appreciated his honesty in saying that. We haven't proven it. But then you go to the next question, well then how do you know it did arise from natural processes, since you haven't proven it, right? And his answer is, we're here. This is naturalism at its finest, meaning we've decided ahead of time that there can be no supernatural involvement in mankind's existence. We're not going to talk about anything outside of the natural realm. So we end up in this logic loop. How do we know that we came through natural processes? Well, we don't know. We don't know exactly how it happened. Well, then how do you know that's the way it happened? Because we're here. And what they're doing is they're cycling back on, it's not an option that there be a God. See, if you take the humanist worldview, and you'll hear me use several different terms along this line: humanism, naturalism, realism, materialism. All of these kind of boil down. There's some nuances there, but they're boiling down to a lot of the same ideas, which is you have already presupposed and assumed there is no supernatural realm. There is no God. There is nothing that would reach outside of the physical world to make things happen. The other quote is Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he says, God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. Meaning, if you're Neil deGrasse Tyson, the only reason that people believe in God is because we haven't learned enough science yet. So the more we learn, the smaller God gets, because our ignorance goes away, and eventually we'll know enough about science that you won't need God at all. This is just a new, fancier way of saying what people have been saying for years, which is religion is a crutch. Right? When somebody says religion is a crutch, what they're really saying is, the only reason you have God is because you need that warm and fuzzy feeling of knowing that He loves you and you're going to go to heaven when you die and all these sorts of things. It's not real, it's just fantasy to make you feel better. That is mainstream scientists now. So this is the world that we're living in, where what they talk about on a regular basis and their approach to scientific inquiry is materialism, meaning only what is materially here in the physical world is the only things that are possible. So if there's life here on Earth, it must have come from natural processes because natural processes are the only option. it's like if somebody gives you options as to what you want to eat. And they say, well, you can eat escargot or you can have frog legs. The answer for most people is, could you give me an option C? Right? I'm not interested in either one of those. What they do is they stack it already. That there's a lot of different ways that mankind could have come to exist, that life could come to be, that the world could come to pop into existence. You can look at any sort of options out there, but the one option you cannot consider is the supernatural one. So you will often hear evolutionary scientists talk about the counterintuitive nature of evolution. When I say something is counterintuitive, what does that mean? What does it mean to be counterintuitive? Or if you don't want to answer that, what does it mean if something is intuitive? Doesn't make a difference. If there's, a lot of, what? Yeah, counterintuitive is kind of against normal thinking, against the way you would normally tend to think, right? So let me give you an example. You're walking along the beach. This is one that came up in the book. You're walking along the beach, and you see spelled out in shells and rocks, John loves Susie. Intuitively, what would you think? John was there, right? And there's a very real possibility Susie was there too. But John definitely, right? There was a creator behind the whole thing. Somebody came, took those shells or stones, and designed them in an organized, informational way. Counterintuitive would be to say, look at this amazing message that just randomly washed up on shore. Which one is evolution? Evolution is the counterintuitive one, isn't it? It's the one that says, look at all of this information and everything, but it can't have been designed. Johnny doesn't actually exist. It just is a big accident. It's the blind watchmaker that we talked about before. That's materialism or naturalism. One of the new terms that they like to use today is realism, and I feel like that's kind of cooking the books, because if I say I'm a realist, what am I saying about you? Yeah, you are not a realist. You are an unrealist. You're unrealistic. You're fake. So when they say we're realists or realism, what they're trying to say is, one, we believe in only that which is in the real material world. And what we would call the supernatural, they would call the unreal. And that it has a certain tone to it, doesn't it? When you start to talk about it that way. So that's a terminology that they've started to use, and I think it has, there's kind of an emotional element to it. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that? It's the assumptions that they start with that we want to deal with, right? Bill, you look like you're thinking about saying something. No? No. He's just taking notes. He's just thinking really, really hard. You were thinking so hard about your notes that it just yelled at me. I was sure. That's true. I don't know why. I think it's because they put the mic on me. That's unfortunate. Yeah. Okay. This is a version of what you've probably seen before. It's oftentimes on the cover of Origin of Species of Charles Darwin. Not this particular version. I just think this one's funny. But we have been somewhat trained as Christians to get caught up in this debate of from ape to man, right? The origin of species argument is, where did man come from? And though that is a very worthwhile question, and one for which the Bible very much gives you an answer, I would argue, do not let them frame the argument that way. Because as much as, yes, I do think there is an answer to the ape to man argument, one of them being that what is pictured there doesn't even match what Darwin was saying happened. That's not really our strongest ground. Why start there? Why start at the ape? Go further back. Ask the question of, where did the ape come from? And if they say, well, the ape came from a frog, or something else, you say, okay, well, then where did the frog come from? They say, well, the frog came from bacteria. Okay, well, where did the bacteria come from? And what you do is you chase it back until you get to this one basic argument that we have to deal with as human beings. At some point, if materialism is true, meaning there is no God, then life of some form, whether it be an ape or a frog or a bacteria, life had to come from what? Non-life. Life had to come from non-life. And here's one of the great things about that, is that when we back up the argument further and further, and we stop getting into the details of how did one life form evolve into another life form. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't think that's what happened. But that's the argument. They get us stuck in the weeds. We don't have to fight that argument. We go further back and just say, how did life come from non-life? Because if there is anything that we as human beings know at this level of science is, guess what? Life makes more life. Does non-life ever make life? Has that ever been seen in the scientific world? They can't do it. It doesn't exist. In fact, some of you may have seen this in your biology textbooks at some point. Anybody familiar with what this particular slide is? Go back to high school or junior high biology. This is the first recorded scientific experiment. As far as history could tell, this one is the first time somebody ever used that whole idea of let's have a hypothesis and a control mechanism and then an experiment and change one variable and see what happens. There was a guy by the name of Francesco Redi in the 1600s. In the 1600s, they thought that life came from non-life. It was called spontaneous generation. So here's why people thought this. And you see something that would die, like a dead carcass, or you'd see a pile of manure, and then you go out to the dead carcass the next day, or the pile of manure the next day, and what would you find all over the pile of manure? Find flies, right? Bugs. Maggots, larvae. And so you'd find all of these things out there. And so people said, well, that's where life comes from. It comes from dead things. Now, they understood that human life didn't come from there, but they thought some life comes from non-life. Well, Francesco Redi did not buy that idea. So he set up an experiment. He took some rotting meat, and one was a control subject. He put it in a jar with no lid or covering or anything, and then let it sit. And lo and behold, the one in the jar with no covering or anything, over a period of time, it had maggots and flies and so forth, just like what you'd expect. The next one, he took the meat and he put a cork on it and left it. Well, that one had nothing. No maggots, no flies, no anything. And so he did a third one, which is he took a piece of rotting meat and he put cheesecloth over it. And with that one, he found that he had maggots and flies on the top of the cheesecloth, but not on the meat itself. And he came to the conclusion the maggots and the flies were not being born out of the decaying meat. They were growing in the decaying meat, coming from eggs and growing out of it, which that's correct, right? This is modern scientific idea. This is not shocking to any of us, right? None of us in the modern world believe that decaying meat is what makes maggots. We just think that that's the environment it grows in. He debunked the theory of spontaneous generation. And from that point forward, we understood as human beings, life produces life, non-life never produces life. One of the basic building blocks of modern biology. But if you go to the evolutionary theory, and you want to trace it back, if you're an atheist and you believe in naturalism, you are forced to say at some point, life came from non-life. At some point, there was a change that happened there. Anybody have any questions about that? Yes. Right. Right. So it becomes, and this is where, I mean, you look at even the title of the book, that's kind of what the author's getting at, right? It takes faith to be an atheist. Because an atheist has never seen life come from non-life. And he says, well, you shouldn't believe in God because you've never seen him. He's never seen his option either. Yes? Right. 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 So, yes, and I believe platypus is purely because God has a sense of humor. But what you bring up is this idea of the missing link. And I don't know how many people could hear John, but there's this gap between different things. There's a gap between non-life and life. And we don't know how to bridge that gap. It's never been done. It's never even been done in a scientific, controlled environment where we were trying to do it, right? You've heard of Frankenstein, right? Nobody's ever done Frankenstein. That's a science fiction still. We can't take dead things and make them living things. So, and I might mention, even if we could, even if a bunch of scientists could somehow get together and they could take atoms and put them together in molecules and then get amino acids and proteins and all of those things and end up with creating some sort of even single cell organism, what would that prove if a bunch of scientists working really hard were able to produce a single cell organism? It took intelligence. Yeah, right. It didn't happen by chance at all. It takes massive amounts of intelligence. What we've actually found is even with massive amounts of human intelligence, you can't do it. So we're really in this gap, this missing link. And you may have heard that term before, the missing link. And oftentimes when they refer to the missing link, they're talking about the link from one of the ape kinds all the way up to man. And there's a gap if you go back to that origin of species picture, right? There's gaps in between there, between the different ape types all the way up to Homo sapien. And they said, well, there's missing link. I would argue and take it one step further, which I think is what John is saying too. There's not the missing link. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of missing links. You have to find there's all these gaps along the way that we just simply do not have any example of that gap being filled. But once again, I don't think we have to get bogged down in the ape to man debate, because if you take it all the way back to the life from non-life, that one is a very easy foundation to stand on and say we got no proof of that. We just simply cannot back that idea up. Okay, so Psalm 19, we talked about this last week. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. You may have noticed in the news, it seems like in the last, especially the last 10 years, but probably even more so in the last 5 years, there's been a huge uptick, it seems like, on the search for life in the stars. Right? We're looking for evidence of intelligent life. And at this point, they're happy to, the big one they're looking for is just any sort of life on places like Mars. You know, and they're looking for water, looking for life, all these different things. It's interesting to apply to the study and the search for aliens and apply that to the arguments for a creator. And here's what I mean by that. The SETI Institute, first of all, does anybody know what SETI is? Okay, John does. Anybody else know what SETI is? Yeah, Theron does. We're outing the geeks, is what we're doing. Yeah, so SETI is the search for extraterrestrial life. What's the I? Intelligence. Thank you. My brain just froze. And by the way, some of you who didn't raise your hand answered what the I was, so I heard it over here. So SETI is a search for extraterrestrial intelligence, meaning we're going to search out in the stars and see if we can find intelligent existence. Well, SETI has, for about 25 years, your tax dollars supported it. It no longer supports it, so breathe. But it does continue today through private funding, and they're constantly looking for evidence of extraterrestrial intelligent life. Now, here's what I like to do. If we take the standards by which they search for alien life, and we say, okay, these are the standards for intelligence. This is how we know there's an intelligent designer behind some signal from the cosmos, because that's what SETI primarily is doing, is it's sticking antennas, very sophisticated antenna radar arrays, searching the cosmos for any sort of intelligent information being sent out. If we take and apply those concepts to what we do to define intelligence, we're actually using their tools, because many of the same guys, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, both of them are super excited about finding aliens. Right? They both love the idea of SETI. And so these are guys who would say there is no God, but we do believe in intelligent life out there. I might add, how much proof do we have of intelligent life out beyond Earth? Yeah, Scott's like, none. Zero, right? There's zero proof of intelligent life out in the cosmos. But these guys are totally convinced that there are aliens out there. Which takes more faith? Right? So it's an interesting way to flip the script a little bit, and even gives us a couple of tools when talking with people, because there's lots of people who don't want to talk religion, but they love to talk aliens. And we just turned that into a religious conversation. And they didn't realize it was coming. So I kind of like doing fun things like that. So SETI, this is from their website. That's the other thing that I think is fun to do sometimes, go to their own website and look at what they themselves say. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is an exploratory science that seeks evidence of life in the universe by looking for some signature of its technology. What's a signature? Yeah, it's proof of your identity without you being there, right? So you sign something, and you sign a check. Do you do that anymore? Do people ever say? Once in a blue moon, right? Yeah, once in a blue moon. There are people, it blows my mind. There are like some people who never do checks anymore, and it just somehow makes me sad, because I think it makes me feel old. But you sign your name to a check. The person goes to cash the check. Corey doesn't have to be there. They have proof of Corey's existence and approval of the check through his signature. So Corey is invisible. But we agree and are willing to give money to somebody based off of purely his signature on the check. Does that make sense? Well, isn't this the same thing we've been saying about God all along? Isn't this exactly what Romans chapter 1 says? That the proof of God, God's an invisible God. Scriptures are very clear on that. You can't see him. He's the unseen God. If you saw him, what would happen? You would die, right? You see the face of God, you die. But his invisible attributes are clearly seen through the things that he's made. That's the Romans 1 point. It's a signature. So what they're doing in searching for intelligent life out in the cosmos is really no different than what we're doing. So you see how we can kind of flip that script just a little bit on them? So, well, it's no different than looking for aliens. How would you know you found an alien? Well, this is how SETI does it. Once again, from their website, most cosmic radio sources are very broadband. They broadcast over a very wide range of frequencies. For example, the radio emission from a quasar, that's a star, would span most of the diagram above, and the amount of power would change very slowly over the frequency range. Signals produced by technology for communication can be much narrower. Right? So think about your radio. You turn the dial on your radio, and you don't have to turn the dial very far to get an entirely different signal. Right? That's what they mean by narrower bands. Technology for communication can be in a much narrower band than the sounds they get from stars, which is kind of like a screaming sound out there. Much narrower than any known astrophysical source, meaning we don't experience it with stars and black holes and things like that. This illustrates a clear way to distinguish extraterrestrial communication signals from astrophysical signals. Look for very narrow frequency components. So that's the signature they look for is, we're looking for a very narrow band of information when they search the skies and they point their arrays, a very narrow band of information, and then they infer that if we ever found that, as they search the skies, that an intelligent cause without, they infer an intelligent cause without identifying what that intelligence is. Meaning, if they found that narrow band and they heard it over the radio, they're very, very fancy satellite radios, they wouldn't need to know who it was, whether it was Martians or Klingons or whatever, right? They wouldn't need to know who it was. They would just know it was an intelligent thing that sent the signal out. So the idea is if you've got the signature, you know enough to know, I don't know the details about who it is that sent it, but I know they're intelligent. Does that make sense? Everybody with me? Anybody have any questions or anything they want to add? Yes. Well, yeah. That's why they didn't hire you. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of problems with what they're trying to do, and that's why I'm not happy it's private funding. If you want to do it with private funding and some, Jeff Bezos wants to throw his money at it, fine, I'm cool with that. I'm glad we're not. But yeah, there's a lot of problems. But I think part of what they are saying, though, is in the same way that when we send radio signals out, it just keeps going, whether we mean to or not. They may not get all of the communication, but they're just looking for anything, which is interesting to think. Like, you think about Earth, we are a gigantic information bomb out into the cosmos, going in every direction, because we're constantly sending information out. Even if they picked up anything, they would take it. But you're right, there's some assumptions built into that don't necessarily hold a whole lot of water. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good point that if you don't follow the truth, you're going to follow delusion. And and you're talking, this one project alone is in the billions of dollars that have gone to it. And it's just, when you compare it to the things we could spend money on and stuff, it's a chasing of foolishness. So yeah, that's a great point. Mm-hmm. Me too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it is. It's the delusion. It's the foolishness. It's just the craziness of all of it. So while they're out searching for that, and I might mention, I think that's the second time the phrase lizard people has come up in this class. And I don't know what that says about us, but it says something, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so SETI, what they're looking for in a signal is a specific, patterned, repetitive signal. That's what, if you dial it down to what they're looking for, they want it to be specific, that narrow band. It should have a pattern to it, right? Randomness can happen accidentally, patterns cannot, and repetitive, meaning it didn't just happen once, but you're seeing this pattern replaced over and over and over and over again. So if we received a message from space with a language that we could decode that was specific and patterned and repetitive, how long until they got it on national news? They'd stop everything right now, wouldn't they? Immediate. Yeah. And is a good point. I mean, it really is. We all know if they found life on another planet, even the tiniest life, everything would stop. If they found something that matched this pattern and met that criteria, they would immediately call out, there is intelligence out there. There is intelligence. We should stop what we're doing and figure out and communicate and make sure they don't kill us. And so here's the thing. What we want to do is we take their criteria. That's why I like using the SETI program. Let's take their criteria and just flip the script. When we're talking about life, you forget about the telescope. Look at the microscope. Look at DNA. Now, DNA is not something that we've always been aware of, but in the modern era that we're in now, we know quite a bit about it. We've had the Human Genome Project that mapped all of it. And so we know a lot of details, the A, T, C, and G, the 4 different components, of which I always forget what each of them stands for, but we got doctors here, right? A, T, C, and G, what are those? Is one of them adenosine? Is that right? What? Okay, say it again. Thank you. We also have the teacher in the back. So I always forget them. But you have these 4 components to it, right? And so when we're drawing out pictures of that double helix, a lot of times they'll use the A, T, C, and G as representative of those, which is an interesting way to represent it because each of them does represent information just like letters do. And they're combined in very specific ways. And they follow a pattern. And it's repetitive. It's repeated from organism to organism to organism. And it holds a massive amount of data. So it's a huge amount of information. In fact, let's see if I put this in here. Yeah, I did. Okay, so back in 2012, Harvard did this experiment, and they stored 70 billion books on, it was just a small amount of DNA. And they found a way to sequence 70 billion copies of a yet unpublished book. So they didn't put any sort of really great information in there, but they looked there and said, we can do that. DNA can hold that kind of information. It's very good at sharing information. And then, of course, replicating it, because DNA is found where? Everywhere. In every single cell in your body, right? And then when one cell goes to replicate itself, it transcribes all of that information, passes it on to the next one in very complicated processes that are quite elegant, so that the next cell has that information as well. And we understand it at the level that we can even make guesses about things that are quite accurate. I mentioned my color blindness before. Color blindness is easy to track because it's always carried on the X chromosome, not the Y chromosome. That's why more men are colorblind than women, because men have an X and a Y, so whatever X you got, that's it. And so blame your mother if you're colorblind, because you got the X from her. Don't blame your mother. Your mother loves you. But they can track it, and you can track it through generations. DNA is very consistent. It's a consistent way of transferring information from one place to another, and it holds a massive amount of information, right? This is a quote from the Human Genome Project. He said, "We're an inward voyage of discovery rather than an outward exploration of the planet or the cosmos. The Human Genome Project gave us the ability for the first time to read nature's complete genetic blueprint for building a human body or a human being." Think about that language. The first complete genetic blueprint. If you have a blueprint, what does every blueprint have? It's got an architect, don't you? You've got a designer. Somebody made the blueprint. Somebody put the information on the page. Otherwise, you just have a blank piece of paper. Somebody is definitely in need of a parent right now. Thank you, Sherry. So when we talk about the idea of life here on earth, it holds that signature to it. It holds that idea of a designer. Anybody here heard of Anthony Flew before? Yeah, okay, Anthony Flew, he was a very, very famous atheist. And the argument that we just went through is what took him from being an atheist to a deist. Now, he did not turn into a Christian. He didn't give his life to Jesus Christ. He didn't do all the things that I really wish that he had done. But he did come to the conclusion that there is no way, after all the DNA research that we've done, that we couldn't have been designed. It is a very powerful argument to design, as he put it, after 50 years of DNA research. What I think the DNA material has done is showed that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinary diverse elements together. So as you look at all of those different pieces, all the information that we have in our DNA, that is information. And information doesn't happen by chance. Information always comes from intelligence. And so you put those pieces together, and that's what Anthony Flew, he kept waiting for the research to lead away from that. He kept waiting for the research to take us into the part of DNA where it got simpler. And it became rudimentary and basic, and cells were really not that complicated. Darwin was the same way. Darwin he had the view that the cell, because with the knowledge that Charles Darwin had in his day, he thought the cell was probably a very simple thing. Anthony Flew kept waiting for us to get to the really non-complicated part of DNA. Didn't happen. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Irreducible complexity, and we'll talk more about that too, because that's a huge argument that we can use. Irreducible complexity is simply this idea that you have to have everything all there together at once. And if you don't have it all together, you don't have something that's useful. Darwin's theory of natural selection is survival of the fittest. So the only creature that survives to evolve is the one that is the most capable and most fit. If you have part of an eye, like you've got the socket, but you don't have the eye itself, are you more or less fit than the creature that doesn't have an empty, gaping eye socket? Right? You are less fit, right? So the idea is you have to have a whole eye, everything there at once, not just the eyeball, but the nerves that connect it to the brain to transfer the information. All of those pieces have to fit there together. And if you don't have all that, it doesn't work. There's this really cool creature called a bombardier beetle. Go home and look it up, Google it. Bombardier beetles, they their defense mechanism is they combine two chemicals like a skunk would out of their tail side, and they combine these two chemicals, and when those two chemicals combine together, they explode, and they fire a cannon at whatever bug tries to eat them. That's what they do. It's called bombardier beetle. Well, here's the thing. You've got these two chemicals. Imagine being in a laboratory and you have two chemicals, and you just randomly combine them, and they explode. Guess what happens? You're dead, right? You're dead. Bombardier beetle doesn't just have the two chemicals. If he had just the two chemicals, he dies. No evolution. He has the two chemicals, plus he has two tracks in his system to direct those, plus he has a way of aiming them in such a way that they don't combine until they're further enough away from his body. And I think if I remember correctly, there may even be a third chemical in there that retards the process so that it doesn't happen quite as fast, so that it happens, over here and not in his tail side. And all of those things have to be there all at once, or you have a dead bug. There's so much complexity in the world around us. Everything is complex, and if you don't have all the pieces all there at once, you have a massive, massive problem. And that's what Anthony Flew figured out, is DNA is the building blocks for all that. It's the information for all of those things. And all of that's there all right away, all at once, so that you can have life. You think about, especially when something is born, how fragile it is. Everything has to come together and work just right in the beginning. Okay, let's see here. So if SETI received a message from space containing nothing but the genetic code, imagine like they're searching the heavens, and somebody sends a message from the heavens that has the genetic code of a frog. The DNA is sent in the message. What would they think? They'd assume intelligence, right? They go, man, there's intelligent life out there. They just gave us the DNA sequence for a poison dart frog. That's amazing. But it's already here. We already have all of that information here. And so where did that come from? Okay. Our reading for next week will be chapter 6. And we'll look at some more of these things. These 2 weeks, this week and then next week, the big struggle is there's so much stuff that I could talk about and that we could look at in class. I will not look at everything that's in these chapters. So in particular, these are weeks where doing the reading of chapter 5 and chapter 6 are particularly useful, because you will get a lot of stuff that I just won't have time to talk about. We just simply can't cover it all. So I highly recommend reading both of those chapters. Otherwise, the worksheets for Sunday morning's class are out on the table. I was a little slower on getting those out. The copier didn't like me this evening. So if you didn't get a chance to grab one of those, feel free to do so. Otherwise, Carrie, do you mind? Oh, Pam, did you have something?